all for being here. I'm excited to be here. This is a topic that I'm personally very interested in, and I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on the topic as well. A few weeks ago, I attended an accounting conference in New Orleans where the guest speaker was a man by the name of Mike Creighton. Mike is an accounting professor at Providence College, and as well as a self-proclaimed conspiracy buff. Until recently, he was just a regular guy doing regular research that you've probably never read. But at this luncheon, Mike had a story to tell. You see, about 5 years ago, Mike and a few of his colleagues noticed an article published in the Wall Street Journal alleging that there was something funny about LIBOR. The rate, which according to the British Bankers Association website, is the primary benchmark for short-term interest rates globally and is used as the basis for settlement of interest rate contracts on many of the world's major futures and options exchanges and lending transactions. The determination of LIBOR is actually quite simple. The BBA selects a panel of 16 banks based on reputation, expertise, and market representation. Those 16 banks are then responsible for submitting daily rate quotes, of which only the middle 8 are used to calculate LIBOR by means of a basic average. The WSJ article alleged that some of the world's largest banks were reporting unusually low rates based on trends in the default insurance markets. Curious about the article's allegations, Mike and his colleagues set out to investigate the unusual trends in LIBOR using statistical methods commonly used to examine price fixing. What Mike and his colleagues discovered was evidence strongly suggesting that LIBOR was being manipulated by individual banks for profit. For example, they noticed the LIBOR rates were not following the same trends as other risk measures. In fact, in April 2008, LIBOR was dropping as the economy worsened, when if anything, it should have been going up as banks adjusted their risk profiles accordingly. What's more, prior to August 2007, LIBOR had remained completely flat, suggesting that it may have been unnaturally fixed. Because only 8 of the 16 daily rate quotes are used in the calculation of LIBOR, it would only take about 5 of these banks working together to influence the calculation. Wondering what might have caused the sudden shift from completely flat to rapid decline, the co-authors instinctively pulled up the news for August 9th, 2007, which according to the data was the exact date of the shift. They didn't expect to find much, but they actually discovered that August 9th was, according to Mike, the single most terrifying day in the financial global markets. The night before, President George W. Bush had done an interview with Fox News to discuss the worsening economy. During the interview, Bush was also asked to comment on a proposal by Senator Hillary Clinton supporting a $1 million federal bank bailout, to which he firmly responded that he would never, under any circumstance, support a bailout. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, but apparently still within broadcasting range of Fox News, BNP Paribas, the biggest bank in France and a substantial investor in the U.S. subprime mortgage industry, was unsurprisingly displeased with this announcement. Consequently, on August 9th, BNP Paribas announced a temporary freeze on the $2.2 billion that it had invested in the subprime market, and announced that they no longer trusted the credit ratings on the underlying securities. Ironically, the result of the whole debacle was a $154 billion bailout by the Federal Reserve, an amount far greater than the initial $1 million proposed by Senator Clinton. So what did this mean to Mike and his colleagues? What did it mean for LIBOR? Well, from the outside, it's hard to say. But Mike thinks that it meant that on August 9th, 2007, banks that had been previously colluding were now submitting lower rates than their competitors to signal comparative financial health to the markets. In other words, it was every bank for themselves. And it was this funny behavior that drew the attention of the Wall Street Journal and a couple of academics from Rhode Island, ultimately exposing the scandal. Perhaps the most notable characteristic of the LIBOR scandal was how prevalent the practice of manipulating the interbank rate was in the industry. In an interview with Bloomberg, Mike commented, "You have 16 banks employing people who are eating at the same restaurants, drinking at the same pubs. They look at each other as competitors, but also as friends. It's easy to believe that whether or not they're explicitly talking to each other, they understand each other well and are implicitly colluding." Another individual was quoted by the Wall Street Journal as saying that trying to rig LIBOR was common industry practice. It was like spanking children in the 70s. It wasn't bad. While reading about the LIBOR scandal, I was reminded of a time when I was just a little girl sitting in the back seat with my sister as my family drove to the beach for vacation. We had just pulled onto the highway when I heard sirens and saw the flashing lights of the police car pull up close behind. While this scene is one that's all too familiar now, this was the first time I witnessed it as a child, and I remember the exchange between the officer and my father very clearly. Do you know how fast you were going? No, sir, I was just going with the flow of traffic. Well, if all the other cars drove off a cliff, would you too? I can still see my dad's knuckles go white as he gripped the steering wheel tighter and bit his tongue. But the sentiment is similar. We shouldn't break rules just because everyone else is doing it, but we do all the time. In his book, The Cheating Culture, author David Callahan contends that people frequently adopt an everybody does it mentality, and that as a society, we are cheating more and feeling less guilty about it. In fact, a recent study suggests that people who cheat are not only able to escape feelings of guilt, but they might actually feel better about themselves in the long run. More specifically, the study demonstrates that beyond merely sweeping transgressions under the psychological rug, people can use the positive outcomes resulting from their negative behavior to enhance their opinions of themselves. As a professor, I often tell myself that students who cheat on my exams will pay for it and regret having done so later. But oddly enough, the higher marks that they earn by cheating might actually make them feel smarter and more optimistic about their future behavior. A disturbing thought. But when you consider the magnitude of some of the most renowned white-collar crimes, Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, Tyco, and HealthSouth, it's not so surprising that the individuals behind these scandals might actually have thought quite highly of themselves along the way. The truly proud may even be rewarded with a book deal and an op-ed column in Forbes when they're done serving time. Callahan summarily credits America's cheating culture to the ascent of the free market as a sort of unintentional consequence of a laser-like focus on the bottom line, rising economic inequality among American citizens, and the difficulty of enforcing regulation in a laissez-faire environment. He reasons, in today's competitive economy, where success and job security can't be taken for granted, it's increasingly tempting to leave your ethics at home every morning. And the reward for doing so can be enormous. For instance, consider the CEO who Callahan points out will inflate earnings reports to please Wall Street and increase the value of his stock options by $50 million. At a certain point, it seems that cheating becomes unquestionably worth the risk. Risk-taking is a fundamental component of doing business, and effective oversight of risky decisions is a primary responsibility of the board. Directors are charged with protecting a firm's profit-generating activities, or their golden goose, from the uncertainty and risks that can lead to disasters, often referred to as the black swans. One way of doing this is by implementing a comprehensive enterprise risk management initiative, more commonly known as ERM. And one of the benefits of implementing an ERM initiative is that it is meant to consider all the risks that the firm faces. But if some risks are unaccounted for, the purpose of ERM is undermined. According to John Bright, a former risk management executive with Merrill Lynch, many risk models that we use today are better at concealing risks than exposing them. Bright suggests that risk managers should shift their focus from numbers to people, and argues that the best way to prevent trading debacles is to cultivate a network of people and earn their trust. Take them to lunch, buy them a beer. While Bright's methods may seem obvious, they bring up an important point. No matter how elaborate or complex the risk model, it doesn't account for human nature, the beliefs, integrities, and morals of individuals responsible for the day-to-day operations of a firm, and quite possibly the most crucial risk of them all. But how do we quantify ethics risk? Well, first of all, it's important to note that not all cheaters are criminals worthy of serious jail time. According to author, blogger, and speaker Courtney Martin, we have a tendency to otherize and shame those who cheat when in fact we all have the capacity for ethical slips, which in her words are when in our little by little, one by one, we each adjust our own internal compass to point the way of the growing crowd. Moreover, we are still able to look ourselves in the mirror and honestly believe that we are not cheaters. Martin points out that famous cyclist Lance Armstrong, during his interview with Oprah, admitted to looking up the meaning of cheat, which is defined by Webster's as gaining an advantage on a rival or a foe. Armstrong's reaction? I didn't view it that way. I viewed it as a level playing field. While somewhat surprising, Armstrong's reaction is actually a well-documented phenomenon in the field of social psychology known as neutralization. Basically, Before committing an ethical slip, people tend to neutralize the perception that a social norm has been violated, often by looking to peers for evidence that the unethical behavior is in fact the norm. By choosing to perceive his behavior as leveling the playing field, Armstrong was able to deflect disapproval and maintain a positive self-image. While neutralization is thought to occur before an individual engages in unethical behavior, a related theory suggests that people also resolve feelings of guilt and regret after their ethical slip. Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance suggests that individuals employ rationalizations to resolve inconsistencies between their behavior and their pre-existing attitude towards that behavior. Rationalization can be thought of as a mental process that allows individuals to justify dishonest actions and feel less guilty or uncomfortable about their acts. My point is that each and every one of us is capable of an ethical slip, as is each and every employee, manager, or C-suite executive. And before we can discuss how to objectively assess the risk of an ethical slip, we need to understand what exactly makes otherwise good people do bad things. Lucky for us, many years ago, 1950 to be exact, a man by the name of Donald Cressy set out to answer this very question. And where better to start than the local prison? In his book, appropriately titled Other People's Money, Cressy interviews incarcerated white-collar criminals and identifies similarities in their personal accounts. I should also point out that all of the people that Cressy interviewed had one obvious thing in common. They got caught. But what he found was that nearly all of the interviewees also had three other things in common. First, they each described having what Cressy calls a non-shareable problem. These problems varied in nature: a gambling addiction, an attempt to impress a girl, feelings of being overworked and underpaid, but they all had financial implications, and the person felt they could not share the problem with fellow coworkers, a boss, or a spouse. Second, each individual identified an opportunity afforded to them by their position at the company that provided a solution, usually temporary, to their problem. Finally, they offered an explanation, enabling them to view their behavior as either non-criminal, justified, or as a part of a general irresponsibility for which they were not completely accountable. Sounds a lot like our friend Lance Armstrong. Remarkably, Cressy's characterization evolved only slightly over the years and can now be found firmly affixed in professional auditing standards under a fancy new moniker, the fraud triangle. And thanks to the folks at Enron and Arthur Andersen, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act actually requires that all members in an audit engagement team sit in a room together and discuss whether management has the necessary pressure, opportunity, and attitude to commit fraud. Some of the factors they consider: pressures facing the firm, such as a high degree of competition or market saturation, and pressures facing management to meet expectations of third parties, or significant portions of their compensation being contingent upon achieving aggressive targets for stock price. Opportunities arising from significant related party transactions, ineffective monitoring, or internal control deficiencies. And finally, management attitudes consistent with an excessive interest in managing the company's stock price, or an acute ability to rationalize aggressive accounting methods. While it is helpful to understand some of the factors that might lead to fraud, it's also important to consider how we might recognize a fraud once it's already occurred. A recent study by several colleagues of mine suggests that in a post-fraud environment, a second triangle might come in handy. This triangle, aptly named the triangle of fraud action, represents a model for detecting white-collar crimes and obtaining prosecutorial evidence. The components of this model include the act itself, concealment of the act, and conversion, for the benefits accruing to the person committing the act. The idea here is that if an investigator were to collect evidence in each of these three categories, it would make it very difficult for the perpetrator to claim that they had no intention to commit fraud or to deny their role entirely. In summary, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to protecting our businesses and possibly even ourselves from the cheating culture. We can start by getting to know our people and what pressures they may be under at home and at work that might lead them to an ethical slip. We can put on our detective hats and look for evidence of funny business, and we can draft extensive ethical handbooks to be handed out to new employees and occasionally referenced during training sessions. But the real challenge is admitting when something seems too good to be true, and refusing to turn a blind eye when enormously profitable ends are being achieved through particularly questionable means. I'd like to invite each of you to share your own stories of a cheating culture or an ethical slip, and your own thoughts on how we might turn models such as the fraud triangle or the triangle of fraud action into real risk management tools for businesses with real risks.